If you have ever watched a movie set in the old days, you probably picture a medieval brewery as a cozy stone room, where a smiling man dips a cup into a foaming vat while coins roll in all day long. It looks simple and it looks like easy money, but that picture is a myth. Owning a medieval brewery was one of the heaviest, most expensive, and most stressful businesses of its time. And the man in the apron was not relaxing. He was working day and night just to stay out of debt. So today we look at the real prices and the real risks and what every single cost meant, measured in the days of an ordinary worker's labor. And once you understand that, the whole story falls into place. Because beer was not a cozy hobby at all, it was one of the biggest industries of the Middle Ages. And the people who ran the real breweries were dealing with serious money, serious debts, and serious pressure every single day. Beer was not a luxury or a fun treat, it was a necessity. It was the everyday drink of nearly everyone, men, women, because the water in crowded towns was often unsafe. While the brewing process boiled the water, so beer was effectively the safe drinking water of its time. And it was also food. Beer was made from grain and yeast. It carried calories and nutrition, and people literally called it liquid bread. And this meant the demand was enormous, steady, and guaranteed. An average working adult could drink around a gallon of small beer every day, and some drank more. And that single fact is the key to the whole story, because a product that everyone needs every single day is exactly the kind of product that can make a fortune, and exactly the kind of product that is controlled and taxed and fought over. And that is why brewing grew from a simple household chore into a massive trade. In the early Middle Ages, brewing was mostly done at home, often by women, the famous alewives who brewed a batch in the kitchen, and sold the surplus to their neighbors. But as towns grew larger and richer, and as law and trade caught up, brewing stopped being a kitchen sideline and became an industrial business. And once that happened, the rules changed completely. Towns and lords and guilds realized that beer was essential, and whoever controlled the essential thing controlled real power. So they built a thick web of rules around it. A brewer in most medieval towns could not simply set up shop. They had to be a citizen of the town. They had to buy the right to brew. They had to join the local brewers' craft organization. They had to obey strict rules about quality and price. And in many places, customers were required to brew or buy only from approved sources. And with these rules came a very clear economic truth. The demand was huge, but the costs were huge too. And the money was made not by charm or by a cozy atmosphere, but by volume, by careful control of grain, by holding the licenses and the rights, and by surviving the bad years. So the real economics of a medieval brewery were about managing three enormous fixed and running costs: the building, the grain, and the labor, and about selling enough, day in and day out, to cover them and still have something left. And understanding that balance is the whole story, because it was a balance that most people could not hold. Before we go further, it helps to get the words right, because for a long time, medieval Europe actually had two separate drinks, ale and beer. Ale was the older drink of England and much of the north, made from grain and water and yeast with no hops. So it was brewed plain, and it spoiled quickly. Beer, by contrast, came in from the continent with hops added, which kept it fresher longer and gave it that familiar bitter edge. And for years, the two were seen as genuinely different products with different rules and even different traders. But the practical point for the economics is the same in both cases. They were made from grain, they were boiled, and they were drunk by everyone, every single day. And as for the rules that surrounded it all, they were not minor paperwork. They were the very skeleton of the business. In many towns, the brewers formed a craft brotherhood that limited who could join, set the quality of the wort, and fixed the price. And the local lord or the town council could hold the whole trade on a short leash. In some regions, a lord held the right, called the soke, under which his tenants were expected to grind their grain at his mill, and often to buy their drink from his licensed brewers. So a brewer who lacked the right, the license, or the membership was simply out of the game no matter how good their beer was, which means the business was never purely about skill. It was just as much about permission and protection. And all of this regulation is the true background against which every price and every risk in our story has to be read. Let us start with the first great wall of expense. The cost of simply building the brewery, and here the movie image fails you completely, because a medieval brewery was not a shed with a cauldron in it. It was a serious industrial building, and building it was the kind of project that could swallow a fortune. You needed a large stone or timber building, tall enough to hold the great brewing vessels with room for the steam to escape through the roof. You needed a strong floor because a vat full of hundreds of gallons of liquid is astonishingly heavy. You needed cellars or vaults that stayed cool and dark so the beer could settle and be stored. You needed a well or a reliable clean water supply close at hand, and you needed dry storage for grain, for malt, and for stacks of fuel. Then came the equipment, and this is where the cost truly exploded. The heart of the brewery was the great copper brewing kettle, the big vessel where the boil happened. And copper was an expensive metal, far more costly than iron or lead. A single, large copper brewing kettle could cost several pounds all on its own. Beside the great kettle, you needed large flat cooling vessels, a mash tun for soaking the grain, dozens of wooden vats and tons for the fermenting beer. And above all, you needed barrels because beer lived and traveled in barrels, and a working brewery had to own a whole fleet of them. A single barrel of ale held 36 gallons, and a good oak cask was itself worth several days of a worker's pay. And because beer could not sit in the same empty vessel forever, you needed many barrels in constant rotation. And here is a helpful way to think about the entire cost if a common laborer earned about 2 pennies a day, which is what many unskilled workers in England earned in the 1400s. Then to earn a single silver pound, worth 240 pennies, that same laborer would have to work for about 4 months with no rest at all. And when historians look at the records and estimate that building a proper town brewhouse with its coppers, its vats, its cellars, and its cupperage might cost anything from £5 up to 20 or 30 pounds or even more, you can translate that simply and directly. That is the labor of one ordinary working person for 1 year or 2 or 3 entire years, spent all at once before a single drop of beer was ever sold. And the building itself was a task for many skilled hands. Carpenters framed the great timber beams, masons laid the lower walls of stone around the ovens, tilers or thatchers closed the roof, and coopers built the vast tuns. The work took months of patient effort from a whole crew of tradesmen, each of whom expected his daily wage. And because great fires and great weights demanded strength, the brewhouse was built to last and to be rebuilt when it failed. And even the water tells part of the story, for a brewer often had to pay for the right to draw water, or to build and maintain a cistern and pay the labor to fill it, so the drink that conquered the town needed the town's cooperation at every single step. And when you add it all together, the land, the building, the copper, the wood, the tiles, and the wages of everyone who swung a hammer, it becomes clear why the ledger for a new brewhouse ran so high, and why so few ordinary people ever cross that line on their own. And to make this real rather than abstract, consider that when Duke Wilhelm V of Bavaria wanted a proper court brewery for Munich in 1589, he ordered the building erected at the city, and it became one of the most famous breweries in the world. An enormous capital project of exactly the kind that only a ruler could afford. The point being that even the smallest version of this business was not a small venture, and that is why almost nobody built a brewery alone out of their own savings. Builders took out heavy loans, they borrowed from town councils, from monasteries, from rich merchants, and from the lenders of the day, and the cost of that borrowing sat on top of every barrel of beer they ever sold. So before we even talk about the running costs, understand that the medieval brewer started the business deep in debt, and that debt was the first chain around the entire enterprise. Once the building and the equipment were standing, the money did not stop flowing out. The daily and yearly running costs were the real test, and the biggest one by far was grain. Barley, to be precise, because barley was the soul of the beer. A brewery of any size consumed enormous quantities of grain every single week. And grain was expensive. In England, in the 1400s, a quarter of barley, which is about 330 pounds of grain and enough to brew a good many barrels, might sell for around 2 to 3 shillings in a normal year. And since a shilling was the wage of a laborer for 6 days, that single unit of grain already represented a week and a half of a working person's pay, and a brewery needed many quarters of grain at a time and then needed them again the very next week. On top of that, you could not just throw raw barley into a vat. The grain had to be malted first, soaked, left to sprout, and then dried over gentle heat. A slow process that demanded more space, more patient labor, and more fuel. And then came hops, the cone-shaped flour that gives beer its bitter taste and, crucially, makes it last longer and travel better. Hops took over European brewing steadily from the 13 and 1400s onward, and they added a whole new cost and a whole new supply chain on top of the grain. Then came the fuel, and this is the running cost that people always forget. Boiling a kettle of beer took several hours of roaring fire, and a brewery boiled batch after batch all week long. So it burned wood or peat in staggering, never ending amounts. Fuel was a constant hungry expense that never stopped. And then there were the wages of the people, and a real medieval brewery was not one person, it was a crew. You had the brewmaster who knew the exact routines of the mash and the boil, and who held the real craft in his hands, and a good brewmaster earned more than a common laborer. You had the maltster who prepared the grain through its many patient stages. You had the cooper who shaped and repaired the endless barrels. You had the cellarmen who handled the heavy casks, the carters who hauled them through the streets, and often the tapsters who sold by the measure in the tap room. And every one of them had to be paid every week, and their wages were set by custom and enforced by law. So many times over a year, more than half of everything the brewery brought in could be swallowed by the cost of inputs like grain, fuel, and wages before the owner ever saw a single penny for themselves. And on top of all that sat the smaller but relentless costs: the rent for the ground under the building, the dues and taxes owed to the town, the cost of the special license that let you brew and sell it all, the cost of repairs when a vat leaked or a roof leaked, the cost of replacing the barrels that wore out, and the quiet compounding cost of debt, because that construction loan and its interest kept working year after year. So picture the brewery as a furnace, always burning money on the intake side, with everything depending on whether a constant stream of sales could keep feeding that fire. And do not imagine that all of this happened once and then quieted down. A town brewery was not idle. It brewed on a regular rhythm, often several times a week while the weather and the law allowed. And a single brewhouse could turn out dozens of barrels in a good month, each batch a heavy chain of tasks: hauling water, grinding and mashing the malt, boiling for hours, cooling, pitching the yeast and racking the finished beer into clean casks. And between batches came the scrubbing, because a clean vessel was the difference between a fine batch and a spoiled one, and clean water had to be fetched again and again. The water itself was not free in every town. Some brewers paid a standing fee for water rights or shared a town well that could run short in dry months. And even the yeast had to be guarded and tended like a living creature, because a brewery's own strain of yeast was one of its most precious tools, passed lovingly from batch to batch and from season to season. All of which is to say that the running costs were not just money, they were time, muscle, and constant unglamorous attention, night and day. So where did the money actually come from? How did a brewery feed that hungry furnace? The answer is that a medieval brewery made its money from several streams at once, and the smartest owners worked every single one of them. The most obvious stream was the tap room, selling beer by the measure to people who came in to drink. And here the price was well known and carefully controlled. In England, the law of the assize of bread and ale regulated what bread and ale could cost. And for a working person, a gallon of the everyday small beer might cost about a halfpenny or a penny, which was about half a day or so of an unskilled worker's wage, while a gallon of the better, stronger ale cost noticeably more. And that conversion is a useful one to hold on to, because it shows how central the product was. A single gallon of the weakest beer cost a working person hours of labor. But you could not survive on the tap room alone, because a town could only drink so much on any given day. And your neighbors' breweries wanted those same customers, so the serious money came from selling in bulk. Households bought beer by the barrel to keep for weeks, because buying from a professional was often cheaper and more reliable than brewing their own. Institutions were the very best customers of all, because they had large, steady, predictable needs. Monasteries, castles and manor houses, hospitals, guild halls, ships' crews, at the docks, all bought beer in huge quantities and on regular schedules. And this is where the scale of the trade shows itself. Because brewing for a monastery or a port was not the same as brewing for a street. It was production on an industrial level. And in port towns like Hamburg and Bremen, and in famous brewing centers like the German town of Einbeck, breweries found an even bigger prize: export. Beer that could be stored and shipped traveled down the rivers and across the sea. Hamburg in particular grew rich exporting beer across the Baltic and the North Sea. And its brewers built fortunes on barrels that left the town in ships. And that export trade is the clearest possible proof of how industrial medieval brewing really was. Because you do not fill ships with a hobby, you fill them with a factory. And there is one more quiet stream that the smart owners loved: the spent grain. After the grain gave up its sugars to the beer, the leftover mash was not waste. It made excellent nutritious feed for pigs and other animals. So a brewery could fatten livestock almost for free. and that thrifty scavenging made every single batch a little more profitable. And finally, many owners controlled the whole chain of their trade. They owned the bar and the inn as well as the brewhouse, so they captured a little profit at every step from the malt floor to the final mug. And it is worth making the bulk trade concrete. If a household bought its beer by the barrel rather than by the mug, it paid a somewhat lower price per gallon than the tap room. So a barrel of sound ale might change hands for the equivalent of a few shillings, or, in plain terms, for the labor of a working person for 2 or 3 weeks. And an institution ordering many barrels at once would bargain for a still better price in exchange for the promise of steady business, which is how a clever brewer locked in a reliable customer before the harvest ever turned against them. And on the export side, the prize was larger still for a brewing town like Hamburg. Beer was a leading article of trade, and ships leaving the harbor carried thousands of barrels to the north and the east. So the owners of the great exporting breweries were not tavern keepers at heart. They were international merchants who watched the weather, the freight, and the foreign markets as closely as they watched their own vats. And the lesson of all of this is clear. The money in medieval beer came not from any single clever transaction, but from many regular, boring, repeat sales. From the tap, the barrel, the ship, and the hog trough, all tied together by volume and by control of the supply. And now for the part the movies always leave out, the long list of things that could ruin an owner, because a medieval brewery sat on top of a mountain of risk. And the biggest risk of all was the price of grain. Grain was the heart of the business and also its greatest vulnerability, because harvests in the Middle Ages were brutally unpredictable. One year the fields overflowed and barley was cheap and everyone prospered. The next year came rain, cold, or a failing season, and the price of grain could double or even triple within months. And since the price of the beer itself was held down by the assize, the brewer could be squeezed from both ends at once, their costs soaring while the law tried to hold the selling price in place. And in a truly bad year, grain prices climbed so high that people could hardly afford bread on their own tables. And a brewer who had bought grain on credit when times were good could find the debt suddenly impossible. So bad seasons reached deep into the brewery and did real damage. And this single problem, the harvest, probably ruined more breweries than anything else in the whole story. And right behind it sat the problem of debt. Because as we saw, almost everyone built on borrowed money. And a lender does not care about a bad harvest. The interest still came due, and lenders in the Middle Ages did not wait forever. They could call in the loan, seize the coppers, the barrels, the stock, and the building itself, and turn the owner out of their own brewery. And the town records from across Europe show breweries changing hands over and over as debt crushed one owner after another. And there were smaller ruinous losses waiting in the corners as well. A batch spoiled by bad water or by a sudden chill could be lost entirely. A leaky vat wasted expensive liquid in the night. A fire in the brewhouse, always a nightmare where open flames met dry wood and boiling copper, could destroy everything in a single hour. Armies and travelers passing through often demanded supplies and lodging and could carry away the precious grain reserve. The church calendar imposed fast days and feast days that stopped the demand and emptied the tap room. And in the good years, a different danger appeared because when barley was cheap, everyone wanted to brew, and so many brewers flooded the market that the price of beer collapsed and nobody could make a profit at all. And on top of all of that, the personal risks gnawed at the margins. A dishonest partner, an unreliable brewmaster who guarded his secret formulas too closely, staff who skimmed the daily takings, spoilage from poor storage, and always the town officials watching for any breach of the assize. Any watered beer, any short measure, any cheat, because the fines for breaking the rules could be harsh and were repeated without mercy. The medieval brewer was therefore a person living at the mercy of the weather, the lenders, the town, the market, the calendar, and the honesty of their own workers, all at the same time. And it is a wonder, looking at the records, that so many still manage to hold on. So what is the honest, final picture? The truth about owning a medieval brewery is that it was not a cozy cottage industry at all. It was heavyweight business, a capital-hungry operation that demanded a fortune up front, devoured grain, fuel and wages like a furnace, carried crushing debt, and lived permanently under the thumb of bad harvests, tight legal prices, and demanding lenders. The successful brewers were not the carefree, laughing innkeepers of the movies. They were disciplined, organized, well-connected operators who understood volume, who kept their costs down, who controlled their supplies, who cultivated the big institutional customers, and who had the capital and the nerve to survive the bad years. And for exactly those reasons, brewing could be and often was very lucrative, because beer was a necessity with steady, guaranteed demand. In many towns, the brew houses were among the largest and richest businesses. Their owners ranked among the leading citizens, and the great export breweries built real dynasties. But the reward existed precisely because of the risk. The same reasons beer was always wanted: its safety, its nutrition, its place in daily life and in daily thirst were the same reasons the business was always expensive, always fragile, and always demanding of its owner. For the man or woman who actually ran a brewery, the life was a constant round. Up before the light to stoke the fire and set the water heating, tasting the mash, watching the boil, checking the casks in the cool cellar, settling the accounts with the grain dealer, the cooper, and the town, and then doing it all again the next morning. There was no season off because thirst never took a holiday, and the small, honest triumphs, a perfect batch, a debt finally paid, a loyal customer returning for another barrel, were always balanced against the gnawing worry that one bad harvest or one unlucky fire could undo years of careful work in a single season. This is the real life that stood behind the wooden sign. And it is exactly why the truly successful brewers of the Middle Ages were not the smiling faces we imagine from the paintings, but the steady hands with the full storehouse and the honest accounts. So the next time you see that cozy movie brewery with the smiling man in the apron, remember what is actually standing behind the counter: a mountain of debt, a river of barley, a furnace of fuel, a long line of risks, and a working person or two who had to labor for years, day by day by day, just to build the thing in the first place. That is the real story of the medieval brewer, and it is far more impressive and far more human than the comfortable myth ever was.